I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Setting a higher goal for true criminal justice, Susan Herman proposes a new vision of justice called parallel justice. In fact, she's written a book called Parallel Justice for Victims of Crime. She has more than 30 years of criminal justice experience and is recognized worldwide as a leading authority and advocate for victims of crime. And she's my guest today. Hello. You're currently a professor of criminal justice in the Department of Criminal Justice at Pace University.
That's right, teaching undergraduates.
Teaching a lot of courses.
Teaching many courses and enjoying it. I'm having a lot of fun.
About all criminal justice, not just about this new concept that you have.
That's right, that's right.
And you have spent a long time in it.
I have. I started out a long time ago actually wanting to be a mediator and worked in the field of conflict resolution for a while. I worked in the Philadelphia prisons for a while. I was a self-defense teacher for rape counselors for a while. Went to law school. And then over the years, I've really worked with victims of crime in a number of different capacities at the police department here in New York, and then at Victim Services, which is now, as you know, Safe Horizon. And then I was the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime in D.C., and that was a very exciting experience for me.
The victims have been largely or very often overlooked.
That's true.
And
that's true.
That's what really propelled you to this concept. I know, I've done some work in criminal justice with women especially, and battered women. And
I think you've done a great deal of work in criminal justice.
And they're victims. But I never thought of them as being the same kind of victims as victims' families. I mean, it was the families that sometimes drove me a little crazy. And I think that, and I read somewhere where you had talked about the tension between criminal justice reformers and victims' advocates. But your parallel justice really makes so much sense and is really different in a way.
Well, here's, in sort of my work in and around the criminal justice system all these years, I've spent a lot of time with people, and I've wanted myself to reform the criminal justice system and make it a fairer, more humane process for the people who go through it. And you think about people who are working on reforming the system, they're talking about everything from bail reform to sentencing reform to indigent defense to DNA research and exoneration, all of those issues. And most reformers can get involved with and see the value of all of those issues. And then there's this line, and there are people working on victims' issues. And those two camps don't relate to each other very much. And I think it's really problematic. And I've tried to think about why that is. And mostly I think that these people, the reformers, tend to think that it's a zero-sum game, that if you do something good for victims, you're taking away from offenders. And I don't believe that that's true.
Right. It's a hard... I remember years ago, that was the same thing we talked about before, between battered women's advocates and children's advocates. And now, of course, we've seen the connection so much.
Yes.
And you think there's a connection also.
I think there are experiences that are common among victims of crime, almost any kind of crime, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, identity theft, stalking, burglary, hate crime, any of these kinds of crime. What victims feel typically in the aftermath of crime is that they need to have their sense of safety restored. That's primary, safety first, right? Then they need to recover from the trauma of the crime, and then they need to regain a sense of control of their lives. And when I talk about the trauma of the crime, even people who are victims of financial crime often feel a sense that their life is spinning out of control, their life has been turned upside down, they had to miss work to go to court, or nobody believed them, or they don't trust people the way they used to. These are all the same kinds of things, sense of depression about life, same kinds of feelings that victims of violent crime have. And so there's no need to create these hierarchies. Victims of crime
are victims.
Are victims of crime. That's right. And I think they all deserve justice.
So what should we do? What would bring them? What would make it a just system?
Well, first of all, I think we need to say that the criminal justice system isn't necessarily the place where victims are going to find justice. it's part of what victims need. It's certainly most victims want to have the right person identified and prosecuted and to get a conviction. And that's a good part of what victims want. But you can go through that experience, as a small percentage of victims do, and still feel like there's something missing. Your life is still completely out of whack. You need help. You need to get a new job because you were wounded and you can't go back to the job you had, or you need to relocate and suddenly you feel like, you know, how am I going to get to work because my car was stolen? There are all kinds of things that happen that the trial doesn't do for you. So we need to think about how we can help victims rebuild their lives. And I think we need to say that that's what justice means. Treating victims respectfully and helping them rebuild their lives.
So how do we do that?
Well, if you think about, one reason that I called this parallel justice is because I wanted to emphasize that our responses to victims can happen at the same time as we respond to the offender. Let's look at a set of parallel lines. A crime happens, and it triggers a certain series of responses from the government, from the community, from our families, our neighbors, right? And only 20% of complaints that go to the police result in an arrest, and a smaller percentage of those result in a prosecution, and an even smaller result in a conviction. So let's just start by saying, let's make the criminal justice process a more respectful and participatory and meaningful process for victims, and let's enforce the legal rights that they have to participate in that system, which we don't do now.
Right.
But in addition to that, let's think about what our obligations are to victims of crime, separate and apart from that system. And if you think about the criminal justice process, if I said to you, what does it mean to provide justice to an offender? You'd say, well, it means that they're presumed innocent until proven guilty. It means they have a right to an attorney. It means that they're treated fairly. It means that they have a right to safety. There's no vigilanteism. We protect them. We have a whole series of principles. And what I've tried to do is create principles and values for victims. And some of them may sound comparable, but some of them, most of them are just absolutely about victims. And they have to do with things like, we presume they're credible, unless there's a reason to believe otherwise. We start out with the presumption that they're credible. That's right.
Same as
it's a parallel obligation. But that's pretty big, actually.
Yeah.
If you thought about what it means to presume that victims are credible, you'd think that the police would respond very differently, prosecutors would respond differently, doctors, nurses, we would be listening to them with different ears. And then we would make victim safety a high priority. And if you really accepted that value, once again, police would be responding differently to victims. They wouldn't just be looking for evidence and trying to find and convict the right person. They would also be thinking about, what does this person need to do? How can we help this person become less likely to have another crime occur in their lives again, right? And that's not a priority right now for us.
Interesting.
So I have a whole set of values that I call parallel justice principles. And then I've created roles for government and roles for the community and even for people who commit crime, to what we can all do to provide justice to victims.
You say that there's a likelihood that a victim of crime may be again a victim of crime?
Yes, yes.
Is that the
there's a
statistics
whole body of research that
shows
says that there's a this phenomenon called repeat victimization, that once you are a victim of crime, and it happens across many crime categories, for a period of time, and that period of time varies according to the crime, you are more likely than the general public to be a victim of that same crime again. And then after time passes, your risk returns to the same.
Why is that? I mean, what kind of a crime? Give me an example.
It's the intuitively, you immediately go to domestic violence, but the same is true for sexual assault or residential burglary, car theft, hate crime. So there are really two reasons that people talk about. One is that whatever made you vulnerable in the first place, you commute in a high crime area, you live in a place that's particularly dangerous. You are in a whatever the circumstances are
I'm
that
just
make you
thinking about it
vulnerable. You
personally.
live with a violent person, right?
I'm just thinking about it personally. I had a Toyota, and it was stolen.
Yes.
And then I replaced it with another Toyota.
And then what happened?
And it got stolen.
Yeah, yeah.
So we didn't get another Toyota.
Right.
We lived in a brownstone
Right.
where we were burglarized, you know? And then we were burglarized again. And actually, it was 4 or 5 times. And we moved eventually, and we weren't burglarized.
Within what period of time?
Well, it was a long time,
Yeah.
you know, about 10 years. But it was definitely the location that encouraged the
There's
crime, and I
location.
stayed in that location, right.
There's location, and then there are also things that you can do to make it less likely that you'll be burglarized again, right? Target hardening.
Right.
So
It's interesting.
one reason is whatever it is that made you vulnerable, all those factors persist. And the second reason is often that whoever committed the crime against you, whoever burglarized your house, now knows how to get in and knows where everything is and knows you're likely to replace those things, and they know how to get in and get it. And if you don't put new bars on the window, or you don't screw in the air conditioner, or you don't add lighting or shrubbery, you're likely to have the same thing happen again. Right?
And then you also say that people who've been victims of crime sometimes become the perpetrator of a crime.
Sometimes, yeah. There are...
That's very common, isn't it? And what?
Well, it
Witnesses
happens.
to
It happens
crime.
that most people who commit crime, most people in our prisons, have serious victimization histories. So people who end up becoming criminals have been victims of crime. It's not true that most victims of crime end up becoming criminals, but there's a real correlation between what happens to you, the trauma that you experience, and you become more likely than the general population to abuse drugs, more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to be less productive and successful in school and on the job. And for some people,
It's just...
you become someone who also then commits crime. And, you know, there's some really interesting research that says that if you look at juveniles, the most significant risk factor in predicting juvenile delinquency and then later adult criminal behavior is not delinquency, is not drug abuse, is not teenage pregnancy, it's not all kinds of bad things that we think about, it's actually victimization. There's the strongest correlation between victimization and being able to predict juvenile delinquency and then later adult criminal behavior.
Right.
So it's there.
And so much of it is related.
So much
I
of
mean,
it is
some
related.
of the crimes are related, everything else.
Yeah.
So what you're really saying is, but in a way,
I'm saying helping victims is
it's
another
very
way
important.
of preventing crime.
It's a part of the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
It should be a more structured part of the criminal justice system.
Yeah. We should infuse new values into the criminal justice
But it's
system.
the kind of thing we also need for other purposes,
Yes.
like the community, getting to know who the people are for all different kinds of things.
Yeah, that's
Like
right.
the people,
That's right.
like the criminals who are coming, the crime, what do you say? It's a crime.
It helps prevent crime.
Crime.
Yes.
But it also helps prevent recidivism
Yes, absolutely.
because it needs
Absolutely.
that local community structure. Is that what it is? Or more personal structure?
It needs certain victim-oriented values infused into the work of our government and infused into the work of nonprofits and community-based agencies.
Right.
We need to be thinking about victims of crime when we think about how to help each other.
Right.
If I said to you that there was someone in my temple or my church who was ill, who was suffering with cancer and was
Right, we wanna
homebound,
take care of them.
you would think very quickly about a committee of people who would make casseroles and be there every night covering 5 weeks, 6 weeks. If I said to you that there was a rape victim or someone who'd lost a child to murder or someone who'd been burglarized and was just scared stiff and disoriented, we don't think about what can I do in terms of practical assistance? Can I be there with a casserole? Can I provide some babysitting so that that person can get there to court? We don't have the same reaction.
The concern, isn't it?
Well, I think actually there's a fear, a little bit. We know how to talk to people who have cancer in their family. we're not afraid that we're going to do something wrong. We know how to just be with them,
Right.
and we know to offer help. I think a lot of people feel that everything from sort of this funny sense that being a victim of crime might be contagious. You know, they did
That's
something
interesting.
wrong and I don't want to get close to it.
interesting.
To it's really a private matter and they may not want to talk about it. To I don't want to say anything wrong and make matters worse, and so I'm just going to not say anything. To it's not so bad and they'll get over it.
Or it's
they
their
don't
fault.
need me. Or it's their fault. Right. We like to think that they did something wrong to make this happen, because then if I never do anything wrong, it won't happen to me.
I mean, we can also track the history of rape victims. How for years when I grew up, you never really told anybody you
There's
were
a
raped.
lot of shame
Right.
involved.
It was your fault
Yeah.
or something.
You think, well, and you're told it's your fault.
Yeah.
What were you wearing? Where were you?
Right.
Why were you hanging out with those people? And imagine if you're a young person, why'd you go to that party? I told you not to go in the first place. So it's all your fault.
So that's changed.
It's changed
Response,
somewhat.
but not
it's
enough,
Changed
you think?
somewhat. Not enough. I think, in fact, let's just stick with the young person. We've got young people who are twice as likely, teenagers, twice as likely as any other age group to be victims of crime, because they experience the full range of crime, from intimate partner violence to adult child to stranger on the street, the full range, twice as likely to be victims of any kind of crime, and the fewest resources available to them. And when you think about why, part of it is what we were just talking about. We don't believe them. And we're angry at them that they didn't listen to us, or they didn't obey by our rules, or whatever it is, but the end result is we don't help them. Most victim services are not set up to help teenagers. They think they can't, they don't know what to do, and as a result, there's no place for them to turn.
Do we still have persons in need of supervision?
Yes.
That a parent loses temporary custody?
Yes.
And then what happens?
You know, they go into the system, and New York in particular is trying very hard to have fewer and
change it.
fewer people go into the system.
I'm sure people ask you this, Madoff victims. How do we treat them?
Well, we think victims of financial crime, we tend to go immediately to how can we get them whatever money, as much money as we can. And so we start thinking about
Right.
restitution
So that's
and
happening.
compensation.
Right.
They're working on it,
Yeah.
sure.
But then there are people who profited from it. I mean, do you ever delineate between that?
Well, people who were victims of the crime,
Of the Madoff scheme? I mean, if they knew they were doing so well and they kept taking money out over the years, I guess that's all figured into their restitution,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
It's such an interesting concept. Is anybody doing a good job?
People across the country are doing a good job at different aspects of this. We don't have a community yet that I would say they're full-blown parallel justice community, but if you look, and I talk about this in my book, if you look at Burlington, Vermont, they're doing very exciting things, both at the police department level, and they've created this community-wide parallel justice commission, which consists of heads of agencies, heads of state agencies, the commissioner of this, the director of that. They sit around a table with community nonprofit executive directors. And when a victim feels, they meet quarterly, and when a victim feels that the system, the response, has not been appropriate, and I can give you a couple of pretty interesting examples, they go to this commission. And the commission first sees, how can we make things right by you? But then it leads very quickly to, how can we change the system? And that's what you want to see everywhere.
Right.
Some discussion of, if you had this experience where you, victim of crime, went to this hospital for injuries and you were charged a terrifically high amount of money for your medical expenses, and nobody took into consideration that you're a victim of crime and you're going to get compensation, and they went after you for your bills and blew your credit rating. That's a system problem, and we should be identifying victims of crime and talking to victim compensation early on, so that that victim doesn't have to experience any further harm as a result of the crime.
Do you think that we can do it in a larger community like New York City?
I do.
Because
I do, because New York
it's so
City is
similar
just
to the
many
small-
communities.
right.
Many communities make up this great city of ours, but I think we are used to operating at the precinct level or the borough level or the community level. We know how to do that.
You did some work after September 11th, did you, with the victims of crime?
I did.
And did you learn things from that?
Well, I think the country learned a lot about what's possible. Let's talk about it that way.
Right.
What's possible in responding to victims of crime? We had this horrible thing happen, and everybody watched it. And our first response was not, let's find, certainly on a national level, let's find the people who did it and let's deal with that. But our response to victims wasn't, if we find the people who did this, you'll be fine. And that's typically our response to crime victims. If we get a conviction in your case, that's justice. After September 11th, we went into action pretty quickly. And we said, how can we help you? How can we help you deal with the awful thing that's happened to you? And so suddenly we had tax relief for victims of September 11th. I don't see why we shouldn't have tax relief for people who have experienced great turmoil and trauma as a result of any kind of crime. Suddenly we had all sorts of burdens lifted. You had loans that you owed the federal government that we could delay that for a while. You don't have to pay us back right away. We had paperwork requirements to get workers' comp or to get this or to get that, that suddenly, okay, you don't need all that. Everybody wanted to make things easier. And that's the kind of thinking that we need to do on a regular basis. What special allowances can we make for victims of crime that will help them? Why do we charge people money to get their stolen car out of the pound? That's crazy.
That is crazy.
Right?
Absolutely.
So if you think about what the experience of the victim is, start from them rather than the system, we would change many things that we do.
And you say one of the most important things is to acknowledge that that person has been a victim.
Yes, yes. Acknowledge that what happened to them was wrong. If you think about what we do now, when someone is accused of a crime, they go to court, and in court, both a district attorney, but even more importantly, a judge is saying in this public forum, you violated the law, and that's wrong, and this is what's going to happen. Whatever the response is, community service, probation, jail time, whatever it is, someone says what you did was wrong. No one ever says to victims, not just the victims who go to criminal court, not even those victims, but no one says to the vast majority of victims, what happened to you was wrong, from the government. Same sort of pronouncement, because it's affirming their experience rather than just saying, okay, let's get over it.
Have you worked with the police department to try to influence the response of police officers?
I've worked with several police departments at this point, and it's been fascinating because some of them sort of, once you start taking on this value that helping victims rebuild their lives should be a value, it changes their behavior. I've got
their whole way of looking
at it.
They want to take care of you.
Well, they want to address your needs, not just find the criminal and prosecute them or help build a prosecution. They want to figure out how to keep you safe, and they want to make sure that you're treated well. So the 911 operators in Redlands, California, send victims of crime who they've spoken to little cards about 6 weeks after the crime saying, we're thinking of you and just want you to know that we're here. Now, that doesn't cost a whole lot of money, but it means the world to those people who get those cards.
It's just that thoughtfulness and compassion and saying, I'm hearing you.
Yeah.
It's a very important lesson for almost everybody in almost everything, right?
You know, I'll tell you.
We forget it.
There's an interesting thing happened in that same community where they realized that a lot of people who had been mugged on the street were afraid to go out and afraid to go to the drugstore to get their medications, afraid to go shopping. And they took the buses that were used to transport senior citizens, and they said, let's open it up to victims of crime. We know who they are. Let's give them special passes.
Where do they do that?
They do that in California, in a small little town.
That is a very interesting thing.
But that could be done here on a neighborhood basis. You know?
Right. So what we're talking about is that we've got to build social services and government services on a small scale, an immediate scale, with a humanistic approach or something.
Well, we have to think about what victims actually need.
Yeah.
And if we approach justice from that perspective, then you don't think about helping victims as just charity.
There's such very easy, simple things. I mean, why does New York charge for a car that's stolen and you have to get it out of the pound? What can we do to make that change?
Well, they don't now if it's in a police pound, but they do if it's in a private pound.
I see.
You know, and that's, you can do all kinds of things to make that change.
So if somebody wants to try to start this, what do they do?
I think what they do is they get a group of people together from different disciplines, healthcare, criminal justice, social services. They get together, they try and think through what the needs are in their specific community, and I would go small. They'd look at the parallel justice principles that I've laid out, and you'd go agency by agency and say, how would the operations of that agency change if we followed these principles?
It's a very interesting thing, and they should get this book. How can they find this book?
Well, it's not so hard. They can go on Amazon, or they can go to the website of the National Center for Victims of Crime, who published it, or my website, which is paralleljustice.org.
And let's hope that we really have instilled an interest in people to try to take hold of what happens in their neighborhoods and to their neighbors. Well, thanks, Susan. You've done a terrific, wonderful job.
Very welcome.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.